It all started with the discovery of a small box on the doorstep of a Japanese house. No signature, no explanation. Inside were the belongings of a missing child. The father immediately recognized them and fainted right in front of the police. Later it became clear, this box was left by the man whom the country called the most terrible maniac in Japan, Tsutomu Miyazaki. While the experts were studying the contents, another child had already disappeared in the neighboring district. This was the second in a month. Everyone disappears according to the same scenario, a short moment when no one is around, and the child does not return. No screams, no witnesses, no traces of struggle. People simply left the house and did not return. At first, the police did not want to talk about a serial killer. They had no description, no motive, not even a rough profile. But when the belongings of missing children began to be found in different districts, it became clear that these were not coincidences. Patrols checked the neighborhoods, but it didn't change anything. The criminal behaved as if he was following the investigation and purposefully acted at times when the police were weak. The only trace were small boxes of things that he left with the families, as if he wanted to see their reaction. At this time, the main suspect lived an ordinary life. He worked, went shopping, and spent his evenings in a room cluttered with cassettes, manga, and old equipment. No one even thought that this quiet man was watching the children, choosing the moment, and disappearing with them in a matter of seconds. Thus, the police received a name that still scares Japan, Tsutomu Miyazaki. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born with a congenital deformity of the hands. His hands were long and very thin, but it was his fingers that worked differently than normal people. They almost did not bend, the joints were deformed, because of which he hid his hands all his life and held them in an unnatural position. At school, this immediately became a reason for ridicule. Children avoided him, and he avoided children. The situation at home was no better. There was no warmth or open conversations in Miyazaki's family. His father worked all the time and almost did not participate in his upbringing. His mother was distant and did not pay him much attention. Everything was decided without emotions on the principle of everything is fine, period. In Japanese culture at that time, this was considered the norm. Problems were not discussed. The only person with whom he had at least minimal contact was his grandfather. He allowed him to sit next to him, watch TV, and sometimes listen to his short phrases. It wasn't a warm connection, but it was better than nothing. And that's why his grandfather's death was a critical moment in his future. Due to his physical disability, Miyazaki didn't play sports and barely interacted with his peers. Teachers described him as quiet, indifferent, always alienated from the class. He didn't make friends or socialize with anyone. He wasn't directly shamed, but he felt every day that he was strange to others. As he got older, he began to distance himself from real life. He had no friends, no support, no one to discuss his emotions with. He grew up in complete isolation, both physical and psychological. Later, experts would say that his alienation began not in adolescence, but in childhood. And the reason was not only in character, but in a combination of two factors, a congenital defect and a complete lack of normal family contacts. It was on this basis that a person began to form who easily distanced himself from reality. Because of his isolation, Miyazaki began to escape into fictional worlds very early on. At first, it was ordinary magazines and comics. Later, he read manga, anime, and mountains of printed stories that he hid in boxes under his bed. He read everything: humor, adventure, fantasy. But over time, he was increasingly attracted to darker genres, violence, horror, stories about death. It was his way of forgetting about his own problems. At school, he continued to distance himself from people. He did not go to clubs, did not play sports, did not hang out with his classmates at recess. They got used to him being always alone, and eventually stopped even trying to communicate with him. No one knew how he spent his time, and no one was particularly interested. Teachers described him as a capable but passive and uninitiated student. He studied well, but never tried to stand out. He would sit quietly in class, look at his textbook, and wait for the bell to ring so he could go home. There was no aggression in him, but ordinary emotions were almost never noticed either. Over time, manga completely replaced the real world for him. He would spend hours rereading the same volumes, watching anime tapes, and visiting small specialized comic book stores. In Japan, this in itself was not strange, but in his case, the hobby turned into the only and main way to escape from reality. He had no friends, no social skills either. Everything he absorbed from manga and videos was left without any control. No one knew what kind of content he was looking for, what really attracted him, and how it affected him. This would later become a key point in investigation. The police would realize that his hobbies had long ceased to be just hobbies. It was years of preparation for the dark world he had carefully constructed in his head. In high school, Miyazaki got his first video camera. At that time, a real video generation exploded in Japan. Cameras became dramatically cheaper, and young people filmed everything in a row. It was perceived as an ordinary hobby. No one paid much attention to who was filming what. It was this general lack of control that gave Miyazaki the opportunity to take the first steps towards what would later become part of his criminal behavior. At first, he filmed nature, streets, everyday scenes. But very quickly, the camera began to be used to covertly film people. First of all, little girls. He walked through neighborhoods, parks, shopping centers, and, as if accidentally, pointed the lens at those who caught his attention. At that time, no one noticed this and did not consider it suspicious. At the same time, small shops appeared all over Japan, selling cassettes with special content. It was a gray area. Formally, it was not a crime, but a significant part of the material teetered on the edge of what was permissible. It was there that Miyazaki felt in his element. He spent hours reviewing films, buying new ones, carefully collecting everything that even slightly resonated with his secret fantasies. A second of your attention. Let me explain. Tsutomu used to watch adult films there, mainly erotic movies and various titles that contained sexual or violent scenes. Later, the police came to the conclusion that it was then that he finally crossed his inner boundary. Covert filming ceased to be a simple curiosity. It turned into training in control and surveillance. He learned to observe imperceptibly, wait for the right moment, act in such a way as not to be discovered. The camera became the first real tool for preparing for future crimes. Those around him did not notice anything. To everyone else, he remained just another video fanatic, of which there were thousands at that time. He became so obsessed with filming that over time, he began to record all his victims on camera. He filmed them before and after the crime, kept these recordings on home cassettes, and in his free moments, he would return to watch the materials, as if reliving what he had done. No one could have imagined that behind these seemingly innocent recordings, the path of one of the most terrible criminals in Japanese history was already being traced. While his grandfather was alive, he was the only person Miyazaki had emotional contact with. In a house where it was not customary to show feelings, he was the only thread that kept him in the world of people. His parents paid almost no attention to him. Because of their constant busyness, they even hired a nanny, a person who was supposed to look after Tsutomu, but it later turned out that she had some kind of mental disorder. All her care consisted in the fact that they simply watched TV for hours in silence, without communicating or doing anything else. All these years, it was his grandfather who remained his only support. Therefore, when he became seriously ill, Miyazaki began to spend more time with him, not out of love, but because he was his last anchor. And after his grandfather's death, this connection was finally broken. He sat for several hours by his grandfather's cold body, emotionless and insensitive, touching the body and showing what psychologists would later call signs of a break with reality. After the funeral, Miyazaki completely locked himself in his room, spent hours watching cassettes and reading gloomy manga. It was then that his invented voice appeared, a creature he named Rat. During interrogations, he said that this voice seemed to tell him what to do, controlled his emotions, and prompted him to thoughts that had not occurred before. Psychiatrists explained it was not a real voice, but an attempt to translate his own impulses into an external image in order to avoid internal responsibility. The fantasies became darker. He began to watch children in parks, assessing their movements. The camera almost never left his hands. He secretly filmed everything around him. Later, he would tell investigators a phrase that would become key. "I wanted to see what would happen next." It was during this period, as investigators would note, that Miyazaki finally stopped distinguishing between fantasy and reality, and the path to the first murders was already open. The first case occurred in August 1988. A little girl disappeared near her house. She was only a few minutes behind her family and disappeared without a trace. The area was quiet, there were almost no people, but the police still combed the entire area. There was no result. A few days later, the body was found far outside the city, in a place without roads, cameras, and witnesses. It was clear the criminal did not act by chance. He deliberately chose a location where the chance of being noticed is practically zero. Investigators immediately understood that this was not an impulsive person, but someone who plans every step. An examination of the scene confirmed this. Miyazaki acted calmly, without a fight, without chaos. This was not a kidnapping for ransom, or an attack out of emotion. This was a cold, well-thought-out crime. The problem was something else. No traces, no prints, no witnesses. The police did not yet know that he had been watching the neighborhoods for months through a camera, waiting for the moment when the victim would be most defenseless. The parents did not believe that it could be someone local, but it was obvious to the police. The criminal was either a stranger to the neighborhood or moved so inconspicuously, like a shadow. This case showed Tokyo that a criminal had emerged who could bypass all standard police methods. And this was only the beginning. Tsutomu Miyazaki had his own established style. He would approach little girls during the day, in crowded places, and in a calm voice offer to show them something nearby. The children trusted him and followed him. Then he would take them to forest areas where there were no witnesses. The main method of murder was strangulation. Due to a congenital deformity, his hands were elongated, bony, with abnormally long fingers. This physical feature allowed him to completely grasp the child's neck and create strong pressure without any apparent effort. He did it quickly and unemotionally, as if he were performing a technical action. The investigation also mentioned his perverted fantasies, an interest in materials about tying up and controlling the victim, something like BDSM, but in a dangerous, distorted form. This only strengthened his obsession with strangulation and a sense of complete power. After the murders, he often returned to the scene, photographed the bodies, took nails or bones trophies, which he sometimes sent to the families, causing them additional pain. His method was unchanged. A daytime approach, gain trust, an isolated location, strangulation with his deformed hands, and returning for souvenirs. Tsutomu Miyazaki was officially convicted of 4 murders. And these 4 crimes changed Japan forever. So cold, thoughtful, and inhuman was his handwriting. It is about these 4 cases that you will hear further. Less than 2 months after the first crime, a second girl disappears. The pattern was the same. A few seconds of being left unattended, and the child is gone. There were no witnesses, only one man saw someone with a camera, but in those years, this did not arouse suspicion. The body was found faster, and it became clear the criminal was acting more boldly and was hiding his tracks less. Both cases had the same handwriting: sudden kidnapping, complete control over the situation, no witnesses. But in the second case, the criminal left more small details, indicating escalation and a search for stronger sensations. The police already understood that this was a series, but did not officially admit it. The parents demanded increased patrols, but the investigators knew this would not help against a criminal who acts quickly and precisely. The third crime occurred even before they had completed the analysis of the previous one. In a crowded area, among houses and passers-by, but no one noticed the moment of disappearance. The child was playing near the house and disappeared in minutes. The police arrived immediately, but the criminal was already far away. He knew the routes and blind alleys perfectly. This time, there was evidence: a thin man who was watching from afar and a small, light-colored car that had abruptly left the area. The description was vague, but it confirmed that the criminal was acting more openly, not afraid of being noticed. The body was found a few days later, and the nature of his actions became more violent again. It was obvious that he was not just repeating his script, he was developing it. The criminal acted as if he felt superior to the police. After the third case, the police officially admitted that a serial killer was at work in Tokyo. A special group was created, which quickly established a connection between all 3 disappearances. The operatives noticed that the criminal was perfectly oriented in the areas, using crossings invisible to passers-by and quiet paths. And the camera that the witnesses saw could serve as his surveillance. The police checked the video stores, but it didn't yield any results. There were too many such buyers and light compact cars in the city. At this time, strange reports began to arrive. A child crying in the forest, abandoned children's things, suspicious finds. Everything was checked, but the traces each time led nowhere. It seemed that the criminal was deliberately confusing and teasing the investigation. The pressure from the media grew every day. TV shows, headlines, interviews with parents. The city demanded results. And the criminal, it seemed, only became bolder, acting as if he was following the investigation and reacting to every move of the police. It was at this very moment that he was preparing the next crime, the one after which no one would be able to hide. The fourth case was a turning point. The criminal made a few small mistakes, and they gave the police their first real leads. The child disappeared near a vending machine, but the place was more crowded than in previous cases. Witnesses saw a thin man with glasses and a light-colored small car. The descriptions matched those already known. A clear tire track was found near the road, which allowed them to narrow the search to a few car models. The crime scene was clearly in a hurry. Things were thrown carelessly. Some actions were performed unevenly. For the first time, he did not control everything. A special group, working around the clock, combined the testimony, the tire track, and the scheme of the kidnappings. The profile became clear. A thin man in his 20s-30s, a small car, previous surveillance of the victims. The police understood. Under pressure, he would make another mistake, and so it happened. After the arrest, an information explosion began. The press created the image of the otaku maniac, showed a room with manga and cassettes, and blamed the subculture. This caused panic. Anime fans were perceived as suspicious. Stores were checked. Parents demanded bans. The police controlled the sale of cassettes. Society looked for a simple explanation and reduced everything to a hobby, although investigators did not confirm this. Psychologists explained differently. Manga was not the cause. Miyazaki chose this environment because it did not require social contacts. The real roots are deep social isolation. After the case, Japan changed laws on media content, increased the number of school psychologists, and paid attention to suspicious behavior of adults around children. Miyazaki's analysis showed a combination of factors: isolation from childhood, coldness of the family, lack of support, ridicule due to hand deformity, complete lack of psychiatric help, and most importantly, his own actions. Anime or comics were just a cover, not the cause. He became who he was through a mixture of loneliness, psychological trauma, and personal choice, and society long ignored a man who had lost touch with reality. Such was the life of Tsutomu Miyazaki. After his arrest, he spent almost 20 years in complete isolation, awaiting execution. The end came on June 17, 2008. He was executed by hanging. That was the end of Miyazaki's story. Subscribe and see you later.